O'Lantern's Halloween costumes, the sign on the shop read in bright orange letters. It was a small shop occupying a corner of the local strip mall, not standing out in any way beside the sign nor looking any different from 1,000 other costume shops. However, I knew otherwise. I stared at the shop door with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. After all, this was the first year I was old enough to actually go inside, and I'd been wondering and hearing rumors about it for as long as I could remember. "O'Lanterness," I whispered, chuckling at the idea that a simple Halloween costume shop could be such a big deal. Then again, everyone in this town thought it was a big deal. I lived in a fairly small town that probably wouldn't look all that different from most other towns of the same size. We had a main street through town that was appropriately enough named Main Street, as well as all the other usual things. However, this was the only town I knew of where the adults loved Halloween even more than the kids, and it was all due to O'Lantern's. O'Lantern's was a very special costume shop, perhaps one of a kind. They were open only one day a year, Halloween. They would open their doors in some empty building in town first thing Halloween morning and would close late in the evening. No one ever saw them moving in or moving out either. They refused to sell costumes to anyone under the age of 16, which was why I've never been in there before. And most importantly, their costumes were all magic. After gathering my nerves, I finally opened the door, noticing two signs on it. One was a clear announcement that no one under the age of 16 was allowed inside, and the second was their famous motto, "You are what you wear." I gave both signs only a quick glance, having seen them both before. As soon as I was inside the shop, I paused to look around, holding my breath for a moment as I felt I was seeing the forbidden, or at least what had been forbidden to me before now. Before this, every year I attempted to enter the store, I either found the door locked or was met there by the owner who turned me away. So I relished the chance to finally see the inside, even if it wasn't quite as unique as I'd imagined. There were all sorts of costumes and costume props hanging from the walls, on racks, and on shelves, though none of the things I saw looked like the usual cheap store-bought stuff. There were also Halloween decorations all over the place. Fake ghosts and bats hung from the ceiling, while I could see at least a dozen jack-o'-lanterns scattered about the store. And add to the flavor, a real black cat lay curled up in the corner sleeping. However, it wasn't nearly as spooky or otherworldly as I'd always imagined. Then I turned my attention to the beautiful woman who was standing in the middle of the store watching me. She was tall and slender, with a somewhat willowy build and raven black hair that went down to her shoulders. She wore a long and somewhat slinky orange dress with a black sash at the waist and with black stockings and high-heeled shoes. Of course I knew who this woman was. Nearly everyone in town did. Miss O'Lantern was just as famous as her costume shop and just as mysterious. Miss O'Lantern looked like she was in her mid-30s, but I knew she was a lot older than that, though how much older I had no idea. My dad told me that she first opened her shop in town back when he was just a kid, and that she doesn't seem to have aged a day since. Town gossip is that no one has ever seen her other than on Halloween, and that the only time anyone has ever seen her outside her shop was when she stood in front of it to turn underage kids away. "Welcome to my shop, Brian," she greeted me with an amused smile. "Thank you, Miss O'Lantern," I responded nervously. "Jacqueline," she told me with a smile. "But you can just call me Jackie. Almost everyone does." I nodded at that, then realized she'd called me by name. "Did you read your mind?" She finished my thought with a raised eyebrow and a look of amusement. "Hardly. I just pay attention to who lives in town. Besides," she gave me a knowing look, "last year you and your friend Tommy tried to convince me you were really 16 so I'd let you in." She chuckled. "Well, you are old enough now, so what kind of costume are you looking for?" I stammered, "I'm not really sure. I thought I'd look around and see what I could afford." "Miss O'Lantern," Jackie snorted and told me, "I'll help you find the right costume. That's what I'm here for." Then she gestured for me to have a seat. There were no counters with a cash register or anything like that in the store, but right in the middle of the floor there was a small table with a couple chairs. This was where we both sat down. She took a sip from a cup of tea which had already been sitting on the table and watched me thoughtfully. Halloween, she said carefully as she set down her cup of tea, is a very special time of year. It's the one day in the entire year where you can be anything or anyone you want. That's the whole reason I created this shop in the first place. You can hardly waste it by grabbing the first costume you see, can you? Then she smiled again. So tell me, what kind of ideas do you have? Well, I started, feeling a little more relaxed. There are lots of things that I'd like to dress up as, but we're having a costume party at school and we're supposed to be something completely different from what we usually are. And there's a contest to try guessing who everyone is, so I don't want anyone to recognize me. Different than normal and unrecognizable, Jackie mused. That isn't a problem. She gave me a thoughtful look again. Please take no offense, but you look rather ordinary. Average height, average looks, a few pounds overweight, though not enough to be fat. And I'm guessing you're not a sports player or part of the popular crowd. I blinked at that, not sure whether to be offended or just shocked at her candor. Yeah, I responded cautiously. Then perhaps something to make you stand out, she grinned with a mischievous twinkle in her bright green eyes. Something to make you the center of attention, and perhaps even a little mysterious. That would be cool, I nodded agreement, starting to get really excited. I think I have just the thing, Jackie announced with a grin as she stood up, a costume within a costume. Cool, I grinned, feeling extremely curious about what she had in mind. But just then the door opened and a middle-aged couple came into the shop. Jackie nodded to them. Frank, Ellen. I'll be with you in just a minute. I'm helping a first-timer. She winked. I remember my first time, Frank chuckled to Ellen, whom I assumed was his wife. Jackie quickly walked to the back of her shop and pulled a box from a shelf. It was a plain cardboard box with absolutely no writing on the outside, nor any indication of what was inside it. She set it down on the table and announced that this was it. I believe this will be the perfect costume for you, Jackie told me with an amused smile. I can guarantee no one will recognize you in it. Wow, I whispered and reached to look inside the box, but she put her hand on it and prevented me. Now Brian, she told me, first we must discuss the nature of these costumes. I believe you are aware that my costumes are special. Yeah, I nodded quietly. My mom and dad come here every year. Good, Jackie nodded in approval. And as for the cost? What Jackie asked for the costume was a lot cheaper than I would have expected, and when I pointed that out in surprise, she just chuckled. I do not sell for profit. Halloween is a very special holiday for me, so I do this to honor the spirit of this day. I quickly paid the $15 she asked, incredibly relieved to be getting off so cheaply. As a 16-year-old guy, I didn't exactly have a lot of cash, so wasn't expecting to be able to buy much. The idea of getting a whole costume that was perfect for me had never even entered my mind. Just as I was turning to leave, it suddenly dawned on me that I not only hadn't tried the costume on but hadn't even seen it yet. What if it's not my size? I asked Jackie, who was just about to help the other couple. Trust me, she responded with a raised eyebrow and a wry look, size will not be an issue. And remember, as with Cinderella, the magic ends at midnight. I nodded at that and then left the store, passing my friend Tommy just outside it. He was my age, but a bit taller and thinner, with short cropped hair. Tommy just looked at the box under my arm and nodded in understanding before going into a lanterness himself. Tommy and I had been friends for years, and normally we might have come to check out a lanterness together now that we were both finally old enough. However, we both wanted to get into the spirit of the costume party by getting costumes no one would recognize us in, including each other. So we decided to go costume shopping separately. He has no idea what costume I've got, I chuckled to myself, though of course I had no idea what my costume was either yet. But Jackie had assured me that it was the perfect costume and I believed her. After all, she had a reputation about things like this. I guess it's time to go home and find out what I'm going to the party as. Once I was back home in the privacy of my own bedroom, I could finally see what my Halloween costume was. I was filled with nervous anticipation as I opened the box and took a look at the contents. What the? I blinked, suddenly feeling confused. I quickly took everything out of the box and looked over all the costume pieces. My eyes went wide in disbelief. She gave me the wrong costume. Jackie accidentally gave me the wrong costume. That was the only explanation. Either that or... I looked at it again and gulped. Either this was the wrong costume or it was Jackie's idea of a joke. Or since it was Halloween, it was her idea of a trick. I can't wear this, I gasped, shaking my head in disappointment. I thought I'd gotten a great costume at a fantastic price. I thought I'd gotten a great treat, and instead it seems I've been tricked instead. Damn. Maybe it was just an accident though, an honest mistake. After all, Jackie hadn't looked in the box and there wasn't anything on the outside. It would be easy to get it mixed up with another one. All I had to do was take it back and switch it out for a more appropriate costume. Or trick her, I chuckled, thinking that if this was her idea of a joke, then turnabout was fair play. However, I immediately realized several problems with that. First, I had no idea if this was a mistake or a joke. Secondly, I had absolutely no idea where Jackie lived, only where her store currently was. And most importantly, there were stories about what happened to people who crossed Jackie a lantern. There wasn't any solid proof, of course, just rumors. But those rumors were enough. Just then I heard a voice calling my name. Brian, my mom called from outside my room, get out here and see our costumes. Coming, I called back, taking one more look at the costume I'd bought and shaking my head. I went out to the living room where my mom and dad were both waiting to show off their own Halloween costumes. They'd gone to a Lantern's first thing this morning to pick them up and had already started getting dressed before I even got home. What do you think? My mom asked me, standing in a pose so I could get a good look. My mom stood there dressed in a pirate costume that looked good on her. Damn good. She looked 10 to 15 years younger than normal, probably about 20 or 30 pounds lighter, not to mention bustier. Her waist was thin and her breasts were several cups larger than normal, threatening to burst out of the sexy female pirate costume she had on. She ran a hand through her brown hair and then adjusted her three-cornered hat, then reached down to shift her belt and the real cutlass which hung from it. That costume looks great on you, I told her honestly. It looked a hell of a lot better than any normal Halloween costume possibly could. It was the magic in the costumes which made them fit much better and become much more real than you could believe. I like this one, she grinned. I feel like doing some looting and pillaging. Not without me, Dad grinned. I turned to look at my dad, who was standing there wearing fur boots and what looked like fur underwear, but not much else. There was also the matter of him being at least 4 inches taller than normal and with muscles like a bodybuilder. Even his balding head had changed into a mop of thick hair which hung down to his shoulders. Take a look at this, Dad exclaimed as he flexed his muscles, obviously impressed with their size and power. Then he pulled a large sword from a scabbard on his back and held it out for me to see. It too looked completely real. Pretty impressive. Awesome, I agreed, wishing I could have gotten a costume like that. It would be a lot of fun showing up to the party as a big muscular barbarian. I never get over how amazing these costumes are, Mom said as she admired herself and her improved figure. I'm looking forward to getting to your office costume party and showing these off. Dad nodded agreement and then looked at me. What are you dressing as for your costume party? I hesitated for a moment and blushed as I thought of the costume in my room. It's a secret, I told him, not wanting him to know what I'd come home with. But Jackie said it was the perfect costume for me. Then I'm sure it is, Mom responded with an approving nod. She's always right about these things. Well, we're off to our party, Dad told me, pausing to look around. Too bad there aren't any pockets in this outfit. Have fun at your party, Mom told me with a wink, and be sure to tell us about it afterwards. Once Mom and Dad were gone and I had the house to myself, I went back to my room. I began putting the costume pieces back into the box so I could return them all to a lanterness, but then I paused to think about this costume. Mom said that Jackie was always right about these things. I hesitated, feeling embarrassed for even thinking about this. But as I thought about it, I realized that this costume might be exactly what I'd asked Jackie for. No one would recognize me, I thought aloud, then grinned, not even Tommy. I thought about it for another minute before deciding to trust that this was no accident. I had a costume, a very special costume, so I was damn well going to use it. My heart raced with nervous excitement as I began to get undressed. This costume might have been a bit confusing to put on if it hadn't been for a piece of paper I found in the box with instructions. I read through it and then began to get dressed. First came a nylon body stocking which I slipped on and which covered my body from my neck down. I felt a faint tingling along my skin once I had it on. The next piece of the costume was a bit more embarrassing. It was a dress. It was a slinky black dress with sequins that looked like something the cartoon character Jessica Rabbit might feel comfortable wearing. I slipped the dress on, feeling extremely awkward as I did so. It wasn't exactly my size, but it somehow went on easily and seemed to fit. The tingling along my skin immediately began to intensify. At this point, I noticed that the nylon body stocking I was wearing had pulled tighter, had literally become skin tight over my entire body and was taking more of a flesh color. I also noticed that it was starting to push out in my chest, swelling into 2 small bumps that were beginning to fill out the dress. "Wow," I whispered, already impressed by this costume, and I hadn't even finished putting it on. Now I had just a few more pieces to put on. There was a very thin plastic mask which looked like a woman's face, so of course I put it on my own. It immediately clung to my skin and pulled in much as the body stocking had. I could feel the skin of my face tingling. I could feel my whole body tingling more. And when I added the long blonde wig, it all became even more intense. My entire body felt strange, and though the tingling quickly passed, the strangeness did not. I took a deep breath and shook my head, feeling long hair brushing my shoulders. I took several more deep breaths to brace myself. "Let's see," I whispered as I looked down at myself with a burning curiosity. The first thing I noticed was that I now had the perfect figure to really fill out the dress I was now wearing. I got a good look at the deep cleavage I now possessed as well. I also noticed that it no longer looked as though I was wearing a body stocking or anything else of the sort. It just looked like I had skin, soft, pale, and feminine skin with perfect complexion. "Wow," I exclaimed, feeling extremely impressed. I reached up and ran a hand through my hair, which now felt like real hair instead of a wig. I even gave it a light tug and felt it in my scalp. It was real hair. I was growing even more impressed by the second. I held my hands up in front of me and marveled at the detail of this costume. I now had girl hands with long nails that were perfectly manicured and painted a dark red. Then I turned and used those very hands to cut my breasts through my dress, amazed that they felt completely real. In fact, my whole body felt completely real. I felt my face, and there was absolutely no sign that I was wearing any mask at all. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I had to get a better look at myself. I quickly left my room and went to my mom and dad's room. Their room had a huge full-length mirror on the closet doors. I took one look at my reflection and blurted out, "No way." I no longer looked anything like a 16-year-old boy, not in the slightest. Instead, there was a sexy young woman looking back at me from the mirror. I looked like I was maybe 20 years old or so, with long golden blonde hair and an awesome figure. I had a very slender waist and a bust that any guy would drool over. I knew that for a fact since I was practically drooling myself. "Holy shit," I exclaimed, noticing at the same time that even my voice had changed to that of a sexy young woman. "I'm like a double D." I cupped my breasts again and shook my head in amazement. There were other details that I noticed as well, such as the fact that I was wearing perfectly applied makeup and lipstick, as well as a pair of dangly ruby earrings. There was even a golden necklace with a ruby pendant around my neck and hanging right into my cleavage. "And look at this body," I whispered. I knew that most women would kill for a body like this, and most guys would kill to date a girl with a body like this. I definitely filled out this dress perfectly. The dress looked a lot more impressive on me now than it had when I'd pulled it out of the box. It was a long and sexy black one-piece with tiny sparkly sequins all over it. The dress was completely strapless, though had absolutely no problem hugging my body and staring up. It went down to nearly my ankles, but had a long slit in the side giving a good glimpse of my sexy and shapely leg when I took a step. "Awesome," I grinned, finding my smile to be very sexy looking in the mirror. And the costume isn't even complete. It was with some reluctance that I finally turned away from the mirror and went back to my room. However, it couldn't be helped if I was going to finish putting on my costume and get to the party. When I was back in my room, I looked over the remaining parts of my costume. There were a pair of black stiletto-heeled shoes which were a perfect fit. While I was strapping one of them on, I noticed that I had a golden ankle bracelet on one of my ankles. I stood up and found that I had absolutely no problem balancing in them or even walking as I strolled around my room without the slightest bit of difficulty. I shouldn't be surprised, I mused aloud. A couple years ago my mom was dressed as a naughty nurse when some guy at the party she and dad were at had a heart attack. My mom performed CPR and kept the guy alive until the ambulance showed up, even though she'd never known CPR or anything medical before that. It turned out my mom got all the medical knowledge and skills of a real nurse along with the costume. "You are what you wear," I repeated a lanterness motto aloud. Mom proved it a couple years ago and I was proving it now with the high heels. I bet Mom and Dad really could use those swords they have with their costumes if they really had to. Then I turned my attention to the last piece of my costume. It was a mask. I know I'd already put on the face mask while dressing up like this, but this second mask was completely different. This was an old-fashioned mask, the kind used in those old masquerade balls. It was mostly ceramic, painted black with red trim and had black and red feathers around part of the outside. When I put it on, it covered my nose, part of my cheeks and the top half of my face, while leaving my mouth and most of my lower face exposed. "My masquerade ball costume," I said with a smile, looking at the costume instructions in the box. It said right at the top that this was a masquerade costume. Like Jackie said, this was a costume within a costume. People would see me and think that I was a normal girl who'd been enhanced with the costume and would try guessing which girl I was underneath the masquerade mask. I doubt anyone would even question whether I was really even a girl. Jackie was right. This is the perfect costume. I went back to the mirror in my parents' bedroom and looked myself over with the new additions. It was absolutely perfect. I looked so much like a hot chick in a costume that I never would have guessed the truth if I didn't know. "I really do look like a real woman," I exclaimed, curious about just how far this went. After hesitating a moment, I pulled up my dress to check my groin. I found I was now wearing frilly black panties which I hadn't actually put on any more than I'd put on the necklace or ankle bracelet. However, I barely paid any attention to the panties as I felt my crotch, which had no sign of my usual equipment. As far as I could tell, it was all normal girl parts there now. I have to admit that I was pretty tempted to tear off the dress and really have some fun checking out my changed body, seeing just how detailed it actually was. However, I knew that just wasn't possible. The way these costumes worked was that if I took off the dress it would break the magic and all the other parts would come undone as well. Instead of being a hot and sexy naked babe, I'd be a 16-year-old boy wearing a body stocking. So if I wanted to really appreciate this body, the costume would all have to stay on. "Then I guess it's time to go," I smiled, striking a sexy pose and feeling absolutely positive that no one would recognize me in this costume, not even Tommy. I couldn't wait to get to the party. The costume party was held in my school auditorium, which was several miles away. I hadn't considered how I was going to get there until after I was already dressed in my costume, and there was absolutely no way I was going to walk all that distance in high heels. Fortunately, I thought to call for a taxi. I was both nervous and excited as I arrived at school and climbed out of the taxi. I adjusted my dress a little and then walked to the auditorium, fully aware that my walk was very sexy and feminine. I'd noticed earlier that not only could I walk in high heels without a problem, but that I walked in a feminine and sexy manner. In fact, all of my body language now seemed to automatically be sexy and feminine. That was all right though, as it was all part of the costume. When I reached the auditorium door, I saw several people gathered in front of it. One of them was in an extremely realistic-looking vampire costume that I assumed came from a lanterness, while the other two were in less impressive costumes that obviously didn't. "Hello boys," I purred to the group, smiling as they turned to stare at me. It looked as though their eyes were about to pop out of their heads, which nearly made me burst out laughing. However, I kept that reaction under control and continued inside. I stopped just inside the auditorium to take a look around and get my bearings. There were Halloween decorations everywhere as well, some tables full of snacks and drinks. There were even tables and chairs scattered around the outside for people to sit at. However, I just glanced over that and instead focused on all the people in the costumes. I couldn't help but trying to guess who was who. Only a third of the people present, if that, wore costumes from a lanterness. Most of the others were store-bought or homemade costumes, on kids who were still too young to be allowed inside the shop or on people who avoided it. There were a number of people around town who avoided a lanterness either from some religious or personal aversion to magic or just because they refused to believe the magic was even real. "That's Bobby Martin," I mused aloud as I glimpsed a spaceman in a cheap costume. "That's Carol Albright." I quickly recognized most of the people who were wearing store-bought or homemade costumes, at least the ones who weren't wearing too much makeup or masks which covered most of their faces. But even those ones were easy to guess when I heard them talking. It was a little more difficult guessing the ones in a lantern costumes, since you couldn't be sure that anything you were seeing was real. When the costume party was announced, they said we should try getting costumes representing something completely different from the way we normally were. Some people took that to heart, while others seemed to ignore it completely. Michelle Smith was one of the hottest girls in school and a popular cheerleader. She fit the stereotype nearly to a T. And though she was obviously wearing one of a lanterness special costumes, I could recognize her in an instant. She was over 6 feet tall at the moment and built almost like a female bodybuilder, covered with muscles and a leather barbarian woman outfit that looked much like a female version of my dad's costume. However, her body might have been transformed by the costume, but her face was completely unchanged. "Take a look at this little man," Michelle exclaimed to some guy next to her as she flexed her arm and showed off her bulging bicep. She was obviously enjoying this turnabout of being bigger and more muscular than the guys. Then I noticed a pale-skinned and skinny goth girl with tattoos all over her arms and several piercings on her face. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, but I just couldn't place her. I watched her for a minute though and overheard her talking to another girl, revealing her real identity as Cindy Williams, a normally overweight and nerdy girl. "And where's Tommy?" I asked as I looked around, trying to see if I could find him. After a minute though, I had to admit that if he was here in the auditorium I couldn't identify him. There were several people who were obviously in a lantern costumes that I just couldn't identify. Tommy could have been any of them, or none. A zombie boy walked past me looking as though he really was dead and half rotting. I winced at the smell, deciding that this costume might be just a little too realistic. That one just might be Tommy, though I couldn't tell and didn't want to get close enough for a better examination. There was one guy in a football uniform that might or might not have been one of a lanterness costumes. It looked like a real football uniform and even included the helmet, but that didn't really mean anything. The fact that he was tall and well-muscled suggested it might be a special costume, but I still couldn't be sure, nor could I get a good look at his face with that helmet on. "That looks like something Tommy would go for though," I mused to myself. I spotted a wolf man on the other side of the room who was obviously wearing a lantern costume. He really looked half wolf and I couldn't help but wondering what it would feel like wearing that costume. Then I saw a costume that kind of surprised me. There was a boy dressed as a stereotypical nerd with thick glasses, acne, pocket protector and all. Again, he seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place him. We're supposed to be something completely different from usual, I thought aloud, so that wouldn't be Tommy. Then again I chuckled. Tommy would never think of himself as being nerdy and unpopular, so he just might choose something like that after all. However, as I watched a skinny nerd girl who was equally stereotypical came up to him and they began talking. It was then that I recognized not only him but her as well. They were a couple of the more popular students in school, a football player and a cheerleader. At least they're sticking to the spirit of things, I chuckled, delighted to see the two of them in such opposite roles from normal. Of course, while I was looking around the auditorium and trying to guess who everyone else was, I was getting the same kind of attention. Guys were all looking at me for very obvious reasons, though a lot of people of both sexes were trying to guess my identity. I could see the looks and imagine what they were thinking. I smiled smugly. Guess away. Sheila Carey, right? One boy came up to me and asked. No, I smiled. Nina Simmons? He asked next. No, I chuckled. Then he asked, Cindy Williams? Now you're just throwing out names, I teased him, enjoying the look of disappointment as I turned and walked away. I went to one of the tables and grabbed myself a small snack and a glass of punch. I smiled to myself as I overheard several people talking about me, one of them even suggesting that I wasn't a student, but a teacher in costume. I bet she's Mrs. Crabtree, one boy was saying. She's old and ugly. How much different could you get than this? This is even more fun than I imagined, I grinned. Jackie definitely picked the right costume for me. It was about this point I noticed the football player heading towards the restrooms and walking right into the girls' room. He immediately came out and went to the other one, looking just a little nervous. So I'm not the only one to switch sides for a costume, I chuckled to myself. I wonder who she really is. I continued walking around the auditorium and mingled a little, being very careful not to give away any clue as to my real identity. I had a lot of people making suggestions as to who they thought I was, but none of them were even close. I even had a few guys hitting on me a little, though it wasn't too serious as they didn't want the embarrassment of finding out they'd been hitting on someone ugly or unpopular. Or even worse, Mrs. Crabtree. God, this is fantastic, I laughed, absolutely loving all this attention and the fact that no one had any idea who I really was. Of course, the way this body felt was pretty damn good too. Unfortunately, I still hadn't found any sign of Tommy. It seemed that he had a costume that was just as good as mine at hiding his identity. That did narrow it down though, as there were less than a half dozen people I thought might really be him. I kept a close eye on my suspects, hoping that something would give them away. While I was doing this, the football player made his way to me and greeted me with, "Hey babe, how's it going?" I blinked at that. "Are you hitting on me? Is that a problem?" He grinned through the protective mask on his helmet. For a moment I just stood there realizing how ludicrous the situation was. A girl dressed as a guy was hitting on me, a guy dressed as a girl. He had no idea who I really was and had no idea that I knew he was really a girl. Just surprised is all. I gave him an amused smile. I thought you'd be so tired of receiving the bad pickup lines that you'd know better than to use them. He just stared at me with his mouth open. "You know. I know what you are." I winked at him, though he probably couldn't see it through the mask I was still wearing. "I just haven't figured out the who yet." He just laughed. "Good. I wouldn't want anyone to guess too easily. I'd be really embarrassed." "Your secret is safe with me," I told him with a chuckle. "As far as anyone knows, you're just a normal macho football player." "Great," he grinned, giving me a thumbs up before turning and hurrying away. He was probably looking for some other girl to get into his role with. Maybe I should do the same. I shook my head with a smile, flirt with a few guys and really get into my role. Of course, walking around all sexy like and making guys drool was fun, but I couldn't imagine myself actually hitting on one. That was just a bit too much. It was just a few minutes after this that I began to notice Mother Nature making her presence known. I frowned slightly, then turned and started for the restroom, making a mental note to go into the girls' room. I didn't want to give myself away the same way the football player had. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt a tingle of naughty excitement. This was the forbidden area, the place guys were never allowed. The only place I could have gone that was even more forbidden would have been the girls' locker room while there were girls in there changing. Unfortunately, it was a disappointment. It looked almost exactly the same as the guys' restroom, except without the urinals and with extra stalls instead. At least I'll have some privacy, I muttered as I went into a stall and locked the door. I took a deep breath, then pulled down my black lacy panties and pulled up my dress before sitting down. It was a bit awkward, but I had to be careful not remove anything, since that could break the magic. It took me a little bit to relax and actually start going, but the moment I began to pee I could feel the usual sense of relief. It felt a little strange since I was obviously peeing through girl parts instead of my usual ones, but the sense of relief was the same as always. I guess it really is all the way, I mused, yet once again marveling at just how thorough this costume was. I quickly wiped myself dry, remembering from health class that girls had to be extra careful about staying clean down there. I was momentarily tempted to stick a finger up inside myself to see what that felt like, but then I remembered my long fingernails and decided that might not be a good idea. So with a sigh, I pulled my panties back up and my dress back down. After washing my hands, I stepped out of the restroom, feeling somehow more secure in my disguise as a girl. It was kind of stupid, but it almost felt like going to the bathroom as a girl was some kind of test or rite of initiation which I just passed. I smiled as I went back to mingling, showing off my body and chuckling as people continued trying to guess my identity. Of course, none of them came close or even suspected I might really be a guy. My feminine body language made sure of that. There was still no sign of Tommy, though I continued looking. I was getting disappointed and was beginning to suspect neither of us would be able to identify the other before the party was over. Then again, knowing Tommy, I wouldn't be surprised if he decided to ditch the party and then later pretend he'd been here the entire time. No, I shook my head, he'd want to really show off how good his costume was. It was just a short time later that the real event started, the costume contest. The first contest was for the best-looking and most impressive costume, which left out most of those who hadn't gone to a lanterness. I thought I was a guaranteed winner, but in this one my costume worked against me. Most assumed my costume was just the fancy dress, some physical enhancements and the masquerade mask. Because of that, I wasn't even in the top 3. It was the Wolf Man who got first place. I might not have won the costume contest, but I definitely got some attention, as nearly every boy in the auditorium and even adult chaperones kept looking at me. I smiled at that, feeling that I was in on some joke that none of them knew. They'd all be horrified if they knew I was just a guy under here. That made this all the more hilarious. Then came the other costume contest, the one I was quite confident in. All those whose identities had been accurately guessed were disqualified, and those of us whose identity still remained a mystery were brought to the stage. Now it's my time, I purred as I strolled up to the stage with my sexy walk. There were only 4 of us total on stage, 3 of us with costumes from a lanterness. There was the zombie, the Wolf Man, and someone in a homemade robot costume with a helmet that covered their entire face and head. Okay, Mrs. Olson, a teacher chaperone in a sexy witch costume, called out, "Does anyone have any final guesses to their identities?" Several names were called out, though it seemed largely just random guesses. Mrs. Olson waited until people raised their hands and suggested who they thought we might be. The people in the audience were allowed 1 guess only. After a few guesses, the robot was identified as Claire Winter, who had successfully passed herself off as a boy robot until now. However, it appeared that at least one of her friends wasn't fooled. "So that leaves you 3 still a mystery," Mrs. Olson told me, "the zombie and the Wolf Man." That means all three of you win the mystery prize. The mystery prize wasn't really a mystery, nor was it all that impressive looking. Each of us was given a small trophy with a question mark on it to signify the mystery of our real identity. It wasn't much, but it was worth bragging rights of a sort. Now, would any of you three like to reveal your real identities? Mrs. Olson asked us. Sure, I purred in my sexy voice. I could see the looks of interest and curiosity from the audience as I reached up and pulled off my masquerade mask. Of course, I had a beautiful girl's face beneath it rather than my own, so they still had no idea who I really was. I smiled as I saw the blank looks as no one recognized me. Then I put the mask back on and left the stage. The zombie and Wolfman both looked as though they'd been about to reveal their own identities until my little stunt. Then, not to be outdone, they decided to go ahead and keep their own identities a mystery as well. I suspected, though, that they'd show up at school with their trophies to brag about how no one had been able to recognize them. I was definitely enjoying myself, especially since no one had been able to even guess close to my real identity. Jackie had been perfectly right in picking this costume for me. However, I was just a little disappointed that I hadn't been able to pick out Tommy. Just then I heard the sound of a cell phone ringing and looked around, noticing the wolf man pulling a phone from a pocket in his tattered pants. He glanced at it quickly, then put it back away without actually answering it. However, that was answer enough. Gotcha, I smirked, having recognized Tommy's ringtone. I thought about confronting him about his real identity, but that would mean revealing my own. I wasn't about to do that, at least not while I was still wearing the costume. As much as I enjoyed going to the party as a sexy girl, it would be far too embarrassing if everyone knew who I was while still wearing it. Instead, I decided that when I talked to him tomorrow, I'd casually mention that I liked his wolf costume. That was bound to be fun. Since the costume party was wrapping up, I made one more round about the auditorium, gently brushing away a few more guesses and even some direct questions as to who I really was. I just smiled politely and told them to keep guessing before finally walking away and calling a taxi. Home. It was comforting, secure, and above all, a place of privacy. The moment I was inside and had the door locked behind me, I let out a sigh of relief and then burst out laughing. I can't believe I got away with it, I exclaimed, grinning as I strolled through my house. My high heels clicked on the kitchen floor as I went to check the fridge and see if there was anything to snack on. It wasn't that I was hungry since I'd been snacking at the party, but it was a sort of habit. Whenever my mom and dad were out of the house, I just had to poke my nose around. At the moment, my parents were gone. They hadn't come back from their own party yet, which wasn't a surprise. They usually came back a bit late on Halloween. And I've got the house to myself until then, I mused, closing the fridge door without taking anything out. I was actually quite pleased my mom and dad weren't home, since I didn't particularly want to face them while looking like this. They'd understand it was just a Halloween costume and would probably even get a kick out of it, but it would be embarrassing. In fact, I'd been thinking about how I'd sneak past them if they'd come home early. Fortunately, that hadn't actually been a problem. So it's just me for now, I chuckled, going to the living room and sitting down on the couch. I barely even noticed that I crossed my legs in a feminine manner. The body language and mannerisms that came with this costume came so easily that it was easy to forget all about them. I leaned back and stretched out, grinning stupidly. Since I was safe at home, I thought I might as well get the costume off. I took the masquerade mask off and set it beside me, then paused. A quick glance at the clock told me that I still had an hour before midnight when I turned back into a pumpkin. I just smiled, feeling a bit naughty as I mused, why hurry? I had a whole hour left and I had it all to myself. I figured there was absolutely no reason to waste the opportunity to stay like this a little longer, especially when I wouldn't get another like it for at least a year. Definitely a great night, I told myself, holding up my hands and staring at my feminine hands. I smiled and then cupped my breasts through my dress, once again delighting at just how real they felt. I actually had real boobs. Awesome. I couldn't resist the temptation for a better look and tried pulling the dress down and away from them. But as I pulled the top of the dress away, I immediately felt a tingling running along my skin, indicating that the magic was about to break. I quickly let the dress go back to fully covering my breasts, a little disappointed that I couldn't get the full experience. This costume might be great, but it had a few annoying limits. After this, I went back to my mom and dad's bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror again. Even after all the time at the party, I still couldn't believe this was really me. It was absolutely amazing. I spent most of the next hour in front of the mirror making sexy poses and admiring myself. Then I got the idea to use a camera to record some of this for future memories. But the entire time I was doing this, I was keeping an eye on the clock. When midnight came, I was prepared for what was about to come. I braced myself as the tingling rushed through my body. It was almost exactly the same sensation as when I put on the costume, though this time the costume was coming off. The tingling sensations passed very quickly and I found myself back to normal. I was a 16-year-old boy wearing a nylon body stocking, an ill-fitting dress, and a few other odds and ends. I quickly started to scramble out of the now useless costume pieces, dropping them to the floor with a disappointed sigh. Too bad, I sighed. A few minutes after I'd taken the costume off, I had it all packed up back in the box it had come in. I felt a little sad as I looked at it, wishing I could just use the same costume again next year, but knowing it just wasn't possible. O'Lanterness special costumes were a one-time thing, only good for that year. You could try the same costume again the next year, but the magic would be gone. I knew this because my mom and dad had a stack of these costumes in the back of their closet. It's too bad, I sighed, carrying the box to my room and slipping it under the bed. Since the magic was gone, it would be pointless to keep it, though I'd hold on to it for now. Still, I couldn't resist smiling as I thought about tonight. The costume party had been fantastic, but even that paled to the excitement of actually wearing such a unique costume. I knew I'd never forget the experience. In fact, I was eagerly looking forward to next Halloween when I could try it again. I had no idea what costume I'd go for, but I was strongly suspecting I'd ask for something sexy and female again. Then I held up the one piece of my Halloween costume which I hadn't put away in the box. The masquerade mask. I stared at the mask for nearly a minute, smiling dreamily as I thought about how fun it had been to wear it and get that kind of reaction. Then I turned and hung it on my bedroom wall as a reminder of tonight. Tommy would probably recognize it the next time he came over, but no one else would know the significance. But I would, and that was all that mattered. I can't wait till next Halloween, I grinned. I have a feeling it's going to be just as much fun as this one.